Do not face Allah alone when astral projecting. Today, while astral projecting, I summoned Allah to try and weaken him so our hexing spells would work better. He is so fucking powerful. I'm not at a power level to do this alone. I barely escaped with my life, and I'm spiritually injured to a great amount, but I think I'll make it. I can't imagine what he would do to a new, unsuspecting witch. I'm scared that I will have to face him again soon, if I ever want to continue astral projecting. I'm currently burning healing incense and drawing spiritual energies from my crystals to try and heal as quickly as possible. Please be safe, everyone. Allah is much stronger than I first imagined, and we will have to do this together if we want to slay a god.
Slaying a god really says it all in terms of what the sort of implicit but also now very explicit mission of this is, because I think that was what struck me most about it. It was just the slaying aspect. And don't get me wrong, I think that that's essentially what they've been trying to do, but in a much more subtle way for quite a long time, in the sense of not necessarily directly killing God, but killing all that God represents.
They're not just attacking the idea of a god, they're attacking reality. Because what they view Allah as, or what they might not know, that Allah is the world. It's not just a guy with a beard in space, but he is everything. He is, and they want to destroy what is, because that is truly the American spirit, to completely reshape this world, to reshape the forms of the earth in accordance with their will, manifest destiny in the most perverse form possible now.
I can't help notice how similar the language is to some kind of game. The notion of a sort of battle or my power level sticks out to me as sounding like someone's in some RPG or something.
Do you ever watch the Ghibli film Princess Mononoke?
I actually haven't, no.
All right, it's wonderful. And if you don't mind, I'm going to spoil it a bit because it's significant to this, because there's a line that's very similar. Basically, there's this woman, and she is a industrialist, and she is kind of wiping out these ancient sacred forests, and they have kind of a local god, the deer god, and she is intent on killing the deer god to have complete control over her domain. So I think that's part of it too, is like they are acting on behalf of a consumer religion against an established tradition. So I think it's undoubtedly that kind of American march toward nothing.
Absolutely. That's what I find so interesting about it, is that the way that firstly the goals of these spiritual exercises tend to be, obviously not in this case, I think there's obviously some glimmer of a benevolent intention in this particular instance, but generally they tend to be oriented towards quite self-gratifying pursuits, a real sort of desire to manifest those material possessions, which obviously, as you're saying, screams a kind of consumerist religion, wherein the sole purpose of that religion is not to submit yourself to what God wants for you, but to actively manifest what you want as an individual. But there's also something deeply consumerist just in the nature of the way that they sort of play around with deities. And there's a really, I think what really struck me about this was the profanity of that. It was the kind of thoughtless picking and mixing of different gods which have different purposes, and this has been sort of analyzed through a lens of postmodernism a couple of times. It's this notion of a sort of postmodern pantheon where you make your own rules about which deity does what and how you can utilize each deity to suit your own particular intention. And so that in itself is again quite characteristic of a consumerist mentality. It's that picking and choosing.
I want to mention another meme that is related, that led to both the moon and the hexing of the Taliban, and carries the moral again. Have you seen the David Lynch psychic attacks? The guy on 4chan who was trying to attack David Lynch?
Oh, I've heard of this, but I haven't seen it with my own eyes. Is that maybe a good thing?
He says, "In my attempt to make David Lynch sick by thinking mean thoughts about him, landed me in the hospital due to a fairly damaging seizure. I was in the hospital for 3 days only, thinking happy thoughts about me and stealing any sort of medical equipment I could find. And I have 2 bags full of hospital equipment now. Tonight, I am back home and I will hook up all the hospital tools and start thinking negative thoughts about David Lynch again. The 3 days should have rested me. And tonight, I will use these heartbeat monitors and toilet things to have extreme negative energy. So, I don't know if we know why he's attacking David Lynch, but he's doing it. Just in the realm of the personal, it's hard for someone who has that much of an infantile view, because something that you get at with a lot of like young magicians is like they want to curse and they want love spells. They want to control other people through like these silly means. They don't have the personal power themselves, but they can't imagine that another person has power. So I think they were shocked at David Lynch's strength, that David Lynch was able to protect himself. Because Lynch, a lifetime of meditation, a lifetime of actual discipline and work. So I think that's what's so hard for young people to imagine, is that there are people who believe in things and people who lead disciplined lives and devote themselves to something beyond themselves. That is because that's a great sin here. It's a great sin to have a cause, because all causes are obviously ridiculous. The only cause worth having is yourself.
Maybe this is just as simple as it is, and it is people enjoying the sensation of it. And this has been a trend in spirituality since, I want to say, the New Age movement, but it probably goes back, and I'm talking specifically in the West. I'm sure there have been shamanic rituals. All these things have been existed since the beginning of time. So I'm not trying to claim this as a purely modern phenomenon. However, something that was quite characteristic of the New Age movement was the shift from salvation to sensation. You had the general emphasis of trying to cultivate these out-of-body experiences. You'd have things like transcendental meditation, speaking of David Lynch, also a big thing of his, all of which were generally oriented towards the experience of that sensation, of a sensory stimuli. And as an aside, it's really interesting. And if you read a lot of mystical, I want to say mystical, I mean pious Sufis, for example, who were not this kind of mystical, but rather deeply pious. And that was pretty much always the case with Islamic mystics. They had the orthodoxy was very, very intact. It wasn't sort of free flowing. And I often think of some of the things that they say about this kind of sensational spirituality. So one of my favorites is Al-Ghazali says, these pseudo-mystics often act as if they are lost in a sea of wonder, but if you ask them what they are wondering at, they do not know. And I think that's really telling, and that often comes to mind when I see a lot of these forms, because it's the sheer awe of it, of the experience, rather than what is actually meant by that experience and what's at the root of it ultimately, which is God. I mean, I'm not sure I could say that about these TikTok rituals.
We're at a time where the aesthetics of occultism have spread far past the practice and the understanding, because I think America especially, but the world in general is progressively less literate. They are able to read, but in terms of like cultural literacy, we're reaching, I think, some of the bare minimum. The people who could read 20 years ago knew far more than the people who can read now. So there's a lot of information, and this is what I love. A lot of my project is just this: like, how do people without an established symbolic understanding of the world make sense of all of this information around them? And I think that we find witch talk is like just they're desperately seeking an understanding of the world through a very, very tiny symbolic system that they gleaned from cartoons and movies. It's not as if they have that basis, whereas the people who understand magic and who want to be gods are doing it, and are most likely in positions of power rather than online, other than me. But